I found the reference by accident. I was researching something else entirely, a footnote in a 1903 inventory report from the Smithsonian Institution, and there it was, a single line buried in administrative prose. Storage facility, building 73. Contents, approximately 12,000 human crania. Restricted access, no further details provided. 12,000 skulls, locked in a room. And the Smithsonian, one of the most transparent research institutions in the world, will not let anyone inside. That footnote sent me down a path I did not expect, because those skulls were not collected randomly. They were not archaeological finds or anonymous donations. They were harvested systematically over 87 years as part of the largest anthropometric study ever conducted in the United States. And the man who started the collection, Dr. Samuel George Morton, was not just a scientist. He was building the intellectual foundation for an economic system that required certain people to be scientifically proven inferior. Morton began his collection in 1830 in Philadelphia. He was a physician, a professor, a founding member of the Academy of Natural Sciences. And he had a theory. He believed that skull size determined intelligence, that races could be ranked by cranial capacity, and that this ranking was fixed, immutable, ordained by nature. He measured hundreds of skulls, calculated volumes by filling them with mustard seed, later switched to lead shot for precision. Each skull was catalogued: origin, sex, estimated age. He developed a standardized measurement protocol: cranial capacity in cubic inches, facial angle in degrees. He was building a database before databases had a name. He published his findings in 1839 in a book called Crania Americana. Europeans had the largest skulls, averaging 87 cubic inches. Africans had the smallest at 78 cubic inches. Native Americans fell in between at 82 cubic inches. And therefore, Morton argued, the hierarchy of races was not a social construct. It was biological fact, measurable, reproducible, scientifically proven. Here is what made Morton dangerous. He was not a fringe crank. He was respected, credentialed, published in the most prestigious journals of his time. The American Journal of Science praised his work. International scholars cited him. And his skull collection became the empirical proof that justified an entire economic order, because Morton was publishing during a very specific moment in American history, the 1830s and 1840s. The cotton economy was exploding. By 1850, cotton represented more than half of all American exports. The value of enslaved people in the South exceeded the combined value of all railroads and factories in the entire country. We are talking about an economic engine worth billions in today's dollars, built entirely on the premise that one group of people could own another group of people. In 1790, there were fewer than 700,000 enslaved people in America. By 1860, there were nearly 4 million. The cotton crop grew from 3,000 bales to 4.5 million bales. New York banks financed southern plantations. British textile mills depended on American cotton. This was not a regional economy. It was a global system, and every part of that system needed proof that it was not just profitable, but natural, ordained, scientific. Morton gave them that. His skull measurements provided the data. Slavery was not a moral crime. It was a natural arrangement between superior and inferior races, validated by cranial capacity, proven by empirical science. Morton died in 1851. His obituary in the Charleston Medical Journal called him one of the brightest ornaments of American science. His followers continued his work. Dr. Josiah Nott, a physician in Mobile, Alabama, expanded on Morton's theories and explicitly connected them to slavery. Nott argued that races were separate species, that mixing them was biologically harmful, and that the South's economic system was therefore not just permissible but scientifically necessary. The timing is not a coincidence. The decades of Morton's greatest influence, 1830 to 1860, were the exact decades when the economic value of slavery reached its peak and the political battles over its expansion became existential. The skulls were not just specimens, they were capital, proof that the system worked because the system was natural. But here is where the story turns strange. After Morton died, his collection was donated to the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia. Other institutions began their own collections. The Smithsonian received skulls from army surgeons, from frontier expeditions, from medical schools. The collection kept growing. By 1900, the Smithsonian had thousands. By 1950, over 10,000. And they kept collecting well into the 1980s. Why? Slavery had ended. The scientific racism that justified it had been discredited. Or had it? Because the same decades the Smithsonian was expanding its skull collection, something else was happening. The same pattern, different justification. Between 1907 and 1979, more than 65,000 Americans were forcibly sterilized under state eugenics laws. The justification was the same logic Morton had used. Certain people were biologically inferior, scientifically measurable, unfit to reproduce. California led the nation with over 20,000 sterilizations. The Nazis cited California's program as a model when designing their own. And during those same decades, from 1932 to 1972, the U.S. Public Health Service ran the Tuskegee study. 600 black men, 399 with syphilis, were told they were receiving free health care. They were not. They were being studied to document the progression of untreated disease. Penicillin became the standard cure for syphilis in 1947. The study continued for 25 more years. The men were not treated. They were measured. Their bodies were data. I keep thinking about that word, data, because that is what the skulls were. That is what the Tuskegee men were. That is what the 65,000 sterilized Americans were. Human beings reclassified as scientific specimens, measured, categorized, stored, and used to justify systems that required certain people to be economically disposable. And the Smithsonian was at the center of it. Not because they were uniquely evil, but because they were doing what institutions do. They were collecting, cataloging, preserving the evidence of an economic logic that required scientific proof. The skulls were not just about race science. They were about labor. Who could be enslaved? Who could be paid less? Who could be sterilized? Who could be excluded? The measurements provided the data. The data justified the hierarchy. The hierarchy organized the economy. But in the 1980s, something changed. Native American activists began demanding the return of ancestral remains. The Smithsonian had thousands of Native American skulls, most taken from graves, battlefields, and reservations without consent. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act passed in 1990. The Smithsonian was required to inventory its collection, notify tribes, and return remains upon request. And that is when the skulls disappeared from public view. Not physically. They are still there, in Building 73, in climate-controlled storage. But access became restricted. Researchers who once could request the specimens now faced layers of approval. Documentation requirements became onerous. And for certain parts of the collection, access was quietly denied. No formal announcement, no public statement. Just a quiet administrative decision that these particular skulls, these particular measurements, these particular proofs of racial hierarchy would no longer be available for study. I have tried to get into that room. I submitted a formal research request to the Smithsonian in 2019. I was told my request was being reviewed. 18 months later, I received a one-paragraph email. Access denied. Institutional policy. No further explanation provided. I am not the only one. A biological anthropologist at a major university requested access to specific crania for legitimate morphological research. Denied. A documentary filmmaker wanted to photograph the storage facility for a film on the history of race science. Denied. A descendant of Samuel Morton tried to view his ancestors' original specimens. Denied. The pattern became clear. No journalists, no filmmakers, no family members, even credentialed researchers faced extraordinary barriers. The Smithsonian's official position is that the collection is being reviewed for repatriation, and that access is restricted to protect the dignity of the deceased. That is the public explanation. But here is what that explanation does not address. The collection includes thousands of skulls that cannot be repatriated, skulls purchased from medical schools in the 1800s, skulls with no documentation of origin, skulls from European grave robbers who sold specimens to American institutions. These skulls have no descendants to notify, no tribes to return them to. They are, in the legal sense, orphaned remains, and they are locked in the same room. Why? If the goal is repatriation, why restrict access to skulls that cannot be repatriated? If the goal is dignity, why not destroy the collection entirely instead of preserving it in secret? And if the goal is to move past scientific racism, why keep the evidence under lock and key instead of putting it in a museum exhibit that shows exactly how institutions use skull measurements to justify economic exploitation? I have a theory, and I want to be clear that this is speculation, not proven fact. But once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. The Smithsonian is not hiding the skulls because they are ashamed of the science. They are hiding the skulls because the science is still too useful. Consider what those measurements represent. Decades of data correlating skull morphology with economic productivity. Decades of research connecting cranial capacity to labor value. Decades of institutional documentation that certain body types predict certain outcomes. Now strip away the racist language, call it something else, biometrics, anthropometry, predictive analytics, and suddenly that data is not obsolete, it is rebranded. I started noticing something strange in recent years. Academic papers on facial recognition technology cite anthropometric databases from the early 1900s, machine learning algorithms trained on historical cranial measurements, workforce optimization studies that reference morphological predictors of performance. The language has changed, the measurements have not. In 2016, a tech company patented a hiring system that used facial bone structure to predict job performance. The patent application cited research from the 1920s. In 2018, an AI startup announced a productivity tool that analyzed employee biometrics to optimize team placement. The underlying data model was based on anthropometric studies from the eugenics era. The company raised $12 million in venture funding. These are not fringe companies. These are venture-backed firms with contracts at Fortune 500 corporations. Employers use facial recognition to screen job applicants, systems that claim to detect personality traits from bone structure. Insurance companies have tested programs that use biometric data and to adjust premiums. The technology is different. The logic is identical. Measure bodies, predict economic value, optimize accordingly. And the Smithsonian skull collection, with its detailed measurements, its geographic diversity, its sheer scale, is exactly the kind of dataset these systems need. Not the racist conclusions, just the measurements, the correlations, the patterns. Feed it into an algorithm, strip out the 19th century language, and you have a tool that does exactly what Morton's skulls did. It provides scientific justification for economic hierarchy. It just does not call it race science anymore. Maybe I am wrong. Maybe the room is locked because of repatriation logistics and administrative caution. Maybe there is no connection between 19th century skull measurements and 21st century biometric screening. Maybe the data is sitting there unused, a relic of a shameful past, locked away out of respect. But I keep thinking about one detail. In 2004, the Smithsonian quietly digitized the entire skull collection. High-resolution 3D scans, detailed morphological data, all entered into a database. The database is not public, but it exists, which means the measurements that justified slavery, the data that validated eugenics, the proof that organized an economic system around biological hierarchy, all of that is still being preserved. Not in a museum, in a server. I do not know what is in that room. I do not know who has access to that database. I do not know what those measurements are being used for. But I know this. Institutions do not lock things away unless they are worth protecting. And they do not digitize data unless they intend to use it. The skulls are not hidden because they are worthless. They are hidden because they are valuable. Not to historians, not to anthropologists, to systems that need scientific proof that certain people are worth less than others. The same systems that needed that proof in 1840. The same systems that need it now, and that is the question nobody will answer. What are we still not being told about the economic value of measuring human bodies? What system is being built on data collected from graves, battlefields, and operating tables over 150 years? And why does the Smithsonian, the institution that is supposed to preserve history for public access, keep 12,000 skulls in a room that nobody can enter? The last time I asked, they told me the collection was under review. That was 4 years ago. The room is still locked, the database is still restricted, and the measurements are still there, waiting for someone to decide what they are worth.